So, this is the Special Education podcast series. This is the podcast number 1, What to Know About Special Education Law. We have Miss Kamisha Black, our special education aide, and myself, Sarah Miller Willis, the Director of Special Education.
So the first question you want to know is, what is special education?
So, special education is instruction that is specially designed to meet the unique needs of children who have learning disabilities or physical disabilities. So, special education and related services are provided in public schools or charter schools at no cost to the parents and can include special instruction in the classroom, at home, in hospitals, or in institutions, or in other settings that are deemed appropriate. The definition of special education comes from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which we'll kind of talk about in a little bit. This law gives eligible children with disabilities the right to receive special education services and assistance in school. These are, and then the state of Ohio takes that further and determines what that should look like on the state level. Some of the words that are like keywords for special education are like inclusion. That's where we kind of push into the classroom or do resource room with the students. The other big word that's kind of out there is the differentiation, where you're differentiating the material for all your learners in a classroom. And then multi-sensory approach. That's where we're tapping into the visual, the auditory, the kinesthetic, which is the moving portion, and then the tactile, where it's more hands-on learning. So that's kind of everything that encompasses what special education is.
Okay. What are the federal statutes that regulate special education?
So there's quite a few things, and they've all got their own little acronym.
Right.
We have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the ADA, and that's the all-encompassing part of anyone with a disability. It makes sure that they aren't discriminated in the workplace, when they attend school, colleges, everything. There's about 5 titles in it that cover that. So like Title I covers employment. Title II is like state and local government. It covers all that aspect. Title III covers public accommodations, like restaurants having to have a wheelchair access,
Right.
or the public, the handicap parking. Title IV deals with telecommunications, making sure that Braille is available, or that I like to kind of compare it to the walk signs now where they have the countdown on them.
Yeah.
And then Title V is just anything miscellaneous provisions. Another statute that we really, which I just mentioned earlier, was the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's called IDEA. And this is where students from ages 3 to 21 can qualify for special education services. They have to have a learning disability under one of the 13 disability categories, and they need to have special education services. Usually that means that they're like 2 to 3 grade levels behind where they're supposed to be. And then each of the state breaks that down into child find, being able to identify, locate, and evaluate children for special education services. The appropriate evaluations. Here in Ohio, we have the evaluation team report. That's where we determine where the student qualifies for special education or not. The big one, which I'll talk about here in a minute, is the free and appropriate public education. And then another one is least restrictive environment. The IEP decides what classroom and setting students with disabilities should be in. And then you create the IEP. That's what outlines what their goals are, what their accommodations and all that is. So as I mentioned, I said FAPE, or free and appropriate education. And what this is that every student is entitled to that free education no matter what.
Right.
It's at the public expense. You do have to have parent consent when you're doing special education. And you have to make sure that you're making progress within the IEP under this provision. The other statute that we like to mention a lot, and it's a big one, is Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. We kind of shortened it down to FERPA. So this is kind of similar to the HIPAA in the health industry. This is where the confidentiality come in. That's so important, protecting those students' information. It's to allow parents the right for their child's records. They can request their students' education records at any time, and they have to be given them. It, like I said, it protects the privacy. They can also request to have those records amended or destroyed when they want, the parents or the student. But the big term under FERPA is confidentiality. I also mentioned the least restrictive environment. You might hear it be called the LRE. During the IEP meeting, we determine whether the student's least restrictive environment, and that least restrictive environment is the general education classroom. Anytime you remove a student with disabilities from that classroom, you're making the environment more restrictive.
Right.
So the IEP team has to decide what the best servicing of the student for their disability is. Typically, it's a co-teaching. That's the new push, is to do co-teaching. But sometimes, pulling them out into a resource room for one-on-one might be necessary, and you've made it a little more restrictive then. When you put them on home instruction or in an institution, you've put them in the most restrictive environment possible. So we have to be conscious of that LRE. I think those are pretty much all the statutes.
Yeah. So the next question is, who's eligible for special education?
So under IDEA, it's any student 3 to 21.
Right.
You can have you can have a preschool. If they can have an IEP in preschool, and then that's a different IEP, and then they get an IEP through kindergarten through 12th grade, or if they need extra time after 12th grade, they have until they're 22.
Okay.
Once they're 22, they're considered aged out, and they'll fall under the American with Disabilities Act, and they'll go on a 504 plan. If they graduate high school, they are considered aged out again there, and they will go on a 504 plan again while they go into a trade school or college, or they might have a 504 plan to help them at their job.
Okay.
Also, to be eligible, you have to fall under one of these 13 disability categories. So we have specific learning disability, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, autism, deafness, hearing impairment, multiple disability, orthopedic impairment, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, and then federally it's called other health impairment, but Ohio has taken other health impairment and made it into 2 categories. You'll have other health impairment major and other health impairment minor.
Okay.
And then they just have to show that there is a significant cognitive delay in reasoning and understanding.